All attendees are in listen-only mode.
Well, good evening, everybody. Welcome to Students for Liberty's e-Leadership Series. My name is Peter Niger, and I'm the Internal Operations Manager for Students for Liberty. We are honored today to have Mark LeBar deliver a talk tonight on equality as a political ideal. But before we begin, though, I'd like to take a moment to introduce Students for Liberty and the e-Leadership program for those of you who are unfamiliar. Students for Liberty is a 501c3 nonprofit organization that is run by students and for students dedicated to liberty. We were formed about 3 years ago to serve a previously unfilled niche at our universities by connecting liberty-friendly students with other students, faculty, organizations, and resources to help them advance their ideas and applications of classical liberalism on campus. The resources we offer include free books for student groups, a large speakers network, protest grants, handbooks on how to run a student organization, tabling kits, leadership training, an academic journal for liberty and society, and of course our bread and butter, our conferences. The e-Leadership program is our way of giving you access to the ideas and mentorship in liberty year-round from wherever you are. We hold webinars each week that put you in touch with the top mentors and scholars for liberty in the country. For a full list, please visit studentsforliberty.org. Now today I'm pleased to introduce our speaker for the evening. Mark LeBar is an associate professor of philosophy at Ohio University in Athens. He holds an MBA from Pepperdine University, an MA in philosophy from the University of Washington, and a PhD in philosophy from the University of Arizona. He has published papers on ethics, political philosophy, and the philosophy of the mind, and is at work on a project exploring the foundations of political obligations and authority in Aristotelian moral theory. Now, just a note, there will be about 15 minutes for questions and answers at the end of the webinar. Feel free to type in any questions you have into the question box. And for those of you interested, this webinar will be recorded and archived on our website in the next week. We will be sending you more detailed information about that soon. Without further ado, I present Mark LeBar.
Thank you, Peter. What I'm going to talk about today is equality as a political ideal. I think this is a topic that has a lot of interest for folks who are interested in liberty, partly because many people seem to think that liberty and equality are in tension or somehow in conflict. I don't think that's right, at least not if we think about equality in the right way and we think about liberty in the right way. But to get to the right way of thinking about equality, we need to do a little work. There's been a lot of philosophical attention paid to equality as a political ideal in the last 20 to 40 years, and some conclusions have begun to emerge about it. There's maybe even some philosophical consensus. And I'm going to walk through some of the ideas surrounding equality as a political ideal and see what kind of sense we can make of it. So it's the case that there are some people, philosophers and others, social scientists, those in political walks of life. Some people think that equality is perhaps the most important aim of government. Their thought is that it's the value in virtue of which we can and should criticize policies and institutions and the like. I mean, think about tax policy or something like that. In virtue of the ways that those policies increase or decrease our equality with each other. And so the question that I want to use to focus our discussion is, can and should equality provide us with that sort of standard as a valuational test on policies? And as we'll see, the answer is maybe a little bit more complex than you might expect. So let's start with the key question, and this is really the key question because equality is so abstract as to be pretty much meaningless. We don't even know what we would be thinking about in proposing that equality is a fundamental aim of government or public policy until we know what kind of equality we're talking about. And what we have to set aside first is what we might call factual or descriptive equality. And by factual or descriptive equality, what I have in mind is equality amongst human beings across any dimension of natural traits. And you can think about intelligence or natural ability or height or weight or anything else that you can imagine that's a property about our bodies or ourselves as physical objects taking up space in the world. So why do we need to set that apart? Well, number one, because people are different. That's not an aim that government could realize even if we wanted it to. And number two, there's no reason to want it to. The diversity among human beings is something that is to be cherished. We enjoy it. We are able to take advantage of it. We can make get a lot of value out of the fact that people are different with differing skills and abilities and so on. So there's absolutely no reason to think that anything like a kind of equality across a factual or descriptive dimension makes any sense as a value whatsoever. So we can set that aside. What we feel most strongly about and the kinds of ideas that really get people animated about equality is something different. It's something normative. And for those who aren't familiar with the idea of normativity, what I mean by it here is it's something about how we ought to treat others and be treated by them. So it's not equality in some way that the world is. It's equality of something that we ought to do or ought to bring about. And the obvious possibility there, the one that features most prominently in both philosophical and I think popular discussions of equality, is some sort of equality of material condition. But even there, we've narrowed down our candidate ideal of equality a little bit, but there still turns out to be quite a variety of options, as we'll now see. In the philosophical literature on equality over the last couple of generations, there have really been four candidate forms of equality that have been proposed as political ideals, proposed and debated and criticized. The first, and maybe the most intuitively obvious, is what philosophers often call equality of welfare, or sometimes equality of condition or equality of outcome. Equality of resources emerged, well, I'll say a little bit more about it in a minute, but it emerged as a response to failures with the ideal of equality of welfare. Equality of opportunity, similarly, is a later development when proposals of the earlier sorts were seen to fail, and equality of luck is probably the most recent to emerge. Each one of these has claims to our moral intuition, so I think it's important to grant that people who propose these as political ideals aren't just sniffing airplane glue. They've been they're responding to ideas and ideals that all or most people have. And I think it's a mistake to simply think, well, they're just ignorant morons or evil ignorant morons, and believe that there's nothing intuitive about these ideals themselves. All of them, at least I find, have some intuitive plausibility, and that's why smart people are willing to defend them as ideals. On the other hand, that doesn't mean that we should accept them. Each one has its own problems. And the other thing that's quite striking, and I'll return to this point in a minute, is that each one is incompatible with the other forms. And what that means is we don't just get to say, well, equality of one of these matters because they're incompatible with each other. And I'll return to this point later on. If we're going to be a material egalitarian, we're going to need to settle on one of these forms of material equality, and it's not clear how we can do that. What I'm going to do for the next few minutes is walk through each of these forms of equality, and I'm going to touch on the intuitions or the motivation that make people think that this is an attractive, for each one, that make people think, yeah, this is an attractive political ideal. And then I'm going to talk about problems that are specific to each of these before returning to some more general problems that I think plague all of these. So we'll start with equality of welfare, and as I suggested, maybe this is the most intuitively plausible and natural idea among the set. And the motivating idea, as I see it, is this, that people are entitled to live roughly equally well, or to have equally valuable or desirable lives. When you hear about people that are born in horrible conditions or suffer horrible fates, and you think, geez, what did they do to deserve that? And the answer is nothing. They just drew the really short end of the straw. And sometimes the really short end of the straw seems to be a product of our social and political environment. We think, how is it that we can make it so some people just have prospects for lives that are so much worse than the prospects for lives that other people have? That's the intuition. problems with this begin when we start asking how well off someone is. And we think, well, how do we want to make intuitive, or how do we want to make measurements? I mean, it's one thing to say that Bill Gates is better off than somebody who's starving in India or someplace. That's pretty easy. But once we move very far away from the extreme poles, it actually gets extremely difficult to measure. Why? Well, a big part of it is that we don't all think the same things make us well off. We have differing views on that. Now, philosophers running into this problem early on said, right, what we need to do is not come up with some kind of objective measure. What we'll do is this. We'll consider what each person takes his own or her own view to be about what makes him or her well off, and that's what we'll standardize. So one way of putting that is to say, you are well off if your desires are satisfied, whatever they may be. And that's attractive because now we can say, sure, people want different things. So what we just care about is how well your desires are satisfied. The problem with that is that people have desires for very strange things, and as some have noted, there are at least two different categories of desires that don't seem to provide us any traction for thinking that we or anybody else owes it to people to help satisfy their desires. One example is prohibitively costly desires. So imagine that someone cultivates a taste for being flown around the world first class on airlines, eating nothing but the most expensive caviar and drinking the most expensive champagne. They might literally work themselves into a state in which nothing else will satisfy them, and they're miserable if they don't get their first class flights, champagne and caviar. But are the rest of us really obligated to satisfy their desires if they have cultivated them in those ways? A second category would be offensive desires. Think about people that would like to see only the Aryan race holding authority over the face of the earth. Do we really think that it's up to us to satisfy desires of racists? That seems implausible. The fact is, we seem to have control over what it is that we desire, and some ways that we can train ourselves to think, yeah, I'd be better off if the world was that way. Some of those just get no grip whatsoever on the reasons that other people have to try to make you better off. Moreover, there's this problem. What if someone squanders what they're given by way of making them well off? Think about addictions. Right? Addicts are people who consume resources at a prodigious rate and are actually made worse off by their consumption. Do we have an obligation to keep trying to improve their well-being no matter how intent they are on destroying it? That seems to ignore that they're at least partly responsible for their own conditions and how well off they are. So those worries have prompted the equality of resources view, where the thought is, yeah, right, we can't necessarily make people well off, but here's what we can do. We can give them roughly equal resources and let them make of those resources what they will. They can direct them in ways that will best advance their well-being, however they conceive of it. Now, one problem with this approach is that many things that count as resources are resources only because someone made them a resource. Think about petroleum, for example, oil. Now, that's a resource. 150 years ago, it was a blight and a curse. What made it into a resource? Somebody figured out a way to make it really useful for human beings. Right? Or think about silicon that's found in beach sand. Same thing. That's just a common, ordinary, uninteresting part of the earth until people figure out that there's ways to use it to do interesting things with electronics. So what are we going to count as resources? If we take seriously that some resources are resources only because of what people have shown us how to do with them, the picture gets a little bit more complex. On a similar note, some people have great capacities to utilize resources in ways that others don't. You could give me an unlimited amount of time and all the sand sculpting tools that there exist on the face of the earth, and I would never be able to produce a sand sculpture like someone has produced here. I just don't have those abilities to convert resources of that sort into something that's interesting and striking in this way. One way that we could solve that problem is to count the very capacities to turn resources into things that are useful or desired, count those as resources. So it would count as a resource for this sand sculptor that he or she had the ability to do this with sand. The problem now is that instead of resources being part of the common physical earthly world that we're going to divide up, now we're starting to divide up things that are parts of us, our abilities or skills or parts of who we are. And most of us are not very comfortable with that idea. So a slightly different approach is to think that what we really want is to create a level playing field, give everyone an equal starting point, and then what they do is up to them. The problem is that we also have measurement problems with opportunity and knowing what it would be for people to have equal opportunities. So for example, how do we compare the opportunities that people have? Suppose that Al has the opportunity to become a florist or a banker, and Betty has the opportunity to become a professional basketball player, an accountant, or an elementary school teacher. Do they have equal opportunities? Is it the case that because Betty has 3 opportunities and Al has 2, that their opportunities are unequal? It's not clear. Nor does it help if we start trying to think about the value of those opportunities to people. If we're thinking about options and their values for people, very quickly it looks like we're not so much interested in equality as we are in liberty, on giving people options to do with things with their lives that they would like to do. That looks like it's a change of subject. So this is also not really a promising avenue. Luck egalitarianism is a way of thinking, okay, all we can do is kind of smooth out the effects of what's called brute luck on people's lives. If you're born with severe crippling disabilities, we'll find some way to compensate you, to try to bring you up to a level that's closer to the level that other people normally enjoy. What you do from that point is up to you. The problem here is that distinguishing what's a matter of luck and what is not is both vague and a matter of opinion. We disagree on the degree to which people's circumstances, lives, and opportunities, their prospects, are products of their own decision-making and the extent to which they're just matters of luck. And we know that it's really bad to export the costs of bad judgment onto others. This picture, I have no idea what this picture is of, but I love this picture because one of these people is exercising really, really bad judgment and seems not troubled by it at all. So we don't want the costs that come to this guy from having exercised really, really bad judgment to turn out to count as luck and to therefore impose a requirement of compensation on the rest of us. So here's a table sort of summarizing the points that I've just made. There's nothing new on this, so I'll pass over this slide and move on. What I want to talk about now is problems that are shared amongst all these material egalitarian views, although to varying degrees. Some of them are cognizant of these problems more than others. One that none of them really take account of very well at all is that they don't consider the connection between the distribution of goods or resources or opportunities or compensation for luck, whatever it is. They don't consider how the distribution of those things is related to producing them in the first place. Very often it's the thought seems to be, well, there's just a giant pot of goodies out there, and we can distribute these things according to whatever principle we settle on, without thinking that the principle that we settle on for distribution may affect how many goodies there are there in the first place. So goodies don't just show up in the world. They don't just fall like manna from heaven, as Robert Nozick pointed out. It takes people and effort and raw materials to produce those things that are satisfying our desires or count as resources, make opportunities productive, and so on. And without having any story about how those connections are made, there's a serious hole for all these views to fill. Another one, and we touched on this earlier, is how well they take account of our responsibility for our lives and how they go in the right way. And this is not a blame game. I think it's an important thing to recognize that part of what we want as grown-up adult human beings is to be held accountable for our choices and to hold others accountable for their choices. There's a large and significant part of our population that we systematically do not hold accountable for their choices. And those are children. Most of us don't like being treated as children. It's demeaning. It shows a lack of respect. It treats people with something less than the dignity that they deserve. And part of what that dignity involves is being accountable for the choices we made. That's part of being a grown-up. So we're responsible not just for getting and consuming the stuff that's out there, wealth or resources or opportunity, whatever it is, but also for contributing to the production of those goods and to cooperating with others in making a world that makes us all better off. So I mentioned this point earlier, and I think it's quite a significant point. Not only is material equality not very compatible with other values, I'll say a little bit more about that in a minute, but its varieties, the four that we've just looked at, are incompatible with each other. So to realize equal outcomes, to get equal welfare, we have to arrange for unequal resources and unequal opportunities and disregard luck. If we take the equal resources approach, that will yield unequal outcomes and unequal opportunities and also leave important forms of luck untouched. If we create equal opportunities, that will yield unequal outcomes. Some people are just going to be better at realizing those opportunities than others. And unequal resources, and again, not compensate for luck. I'd like to say something here about compensating for the effects of luck, but that proposal is so vague and hazy, I'm not sure actually what it amounts to, but I think we can generalize and say that too is not something we can get along with the others. We have to choose to prioritize or give our attention to one of these forms of material equality and disregard the rest. And that fact has actually created an intense degree of argument and competition among material egalitarians. Most of the points that I've been making about these different views, critical points, have been made by other material egalitarians who are criticizing other versions of material equality for their shortcomings and proposing that they can do better. There's been sort of a feeding frenzy. And I think the consensus that's emerging, there's actually something like a consensus emerging among philosophers that have been working on this, that those are all dead ends. That thinking about material equality as a political ideal is not a promising research program. Here's another way to think about a related problem. And that is to ask the more radical question, does material equality matter at all? And there's not an insignificant number of philosophers that say the answer is it's not clear that it matters at all, or even more strongly, it's clear that it doesn't matter at all. And one way to get to that point is to make an important distinction that's very often lost in these conversations. And that's a distinction between having equal material wealth or resources or opportunities or what have you on the one hand, and having enough, having some minimum on the other. Right? Think about a case of that really gets us of abject poverty. And it doesn't seem like the problem here is inequality. It would not be, the world would not be one bit better if we were all in equally dire straits. That would just be worse. The problem isn't inequality. The problem is that these children are starving. They do not have enough. And those are two distinct issues. They are not the same point. Saying that nobody should be below a minimum isn't the same as saying that everybody should be equal. If everybody had what they needed, being equal would be unimportant. And I might add that if nobody had what they needed, being equal would be equally unimportant. The concern that everyone should have enough is actually no reason at all to think that material equality matters. That's something that I think even a lot of philosophers that are sort of more leftist in disposition and outlook are now accepting and beginning to defend. So this is important because once we're thinking about a minimum, we are no longer thinking about equality. We have changed the subject. And moreover, for people that feel strongly committed to liberty, there's some strong precedents among classical liberals. And I'm thinking notably of Hayek, perhaps Locke, John Locke takes this view as well, who say explicitly that government should supply such a minimum or be in the business of coercively enforcing institutions that provide such a minimum. Those of you that may be familiar with the Bleeding Hearts Libertarianism blog may have noticed this week a posting by Matt Swilinski making this case within the parameters of Locke's political theory. Now others, there are many also who do not think that coercive governmental solutions to people having enough, being at a minimum, are the right way to go, and who think the better way to cope with poverty and abject destitution is through people voluntarily choosing to do something about it. So for present, I want to say that's a good conversation to have. That's an important conversation to have, and it's complex and difficult. But we can't even get to that conversation if we're focusing on material equality. In order to think about that issue clearly, we just have to get material equality off the table and out of the room. And the sooner we do that, the better. Here's a worse problem, and I alluded to this a little bit earlier. What if equal distribution of some form, again, pick outcome equality, welfare equality, resource equality, what have you. What if that results in fewer goods being available? If you really are a die-hard defender of equality, material equality, do you really want to bite the bullet and say that equality matters so much that it's okay if we all have less? In fact, perhaps a lot less. So consider, take these bar graphs to be representing a society of 4 people or quartiles of an existing society or something like that, average wealth amongst quartiles. And if you just look at societies 1 and 2, society 1 is unequal, and society 2 levels out those who are in worse shape in the blue area and those who are in the best shape in the red area. You might say, yeah, society 2 is better than society 1, and it's better just because people are equal. But how well does that story hold up if you compare society 2 to society 3? Do you want to say that equality is so important that it would be better to have your society look like society 2 rather than society 3? And that it's so important that it's better that everybody, including the least well-off people in society, those over here at this blue bar, are worse off, right? Is equality so important that everybody is it's worth having everybody suffer, including those at the very bottom of the pile, in order to bring it about? Most people are unwilling to bite that bullet. Most people say, no, that's too high a price to pay. And what that says is equality just cannot be a master political value. There's other things that we care about, and in many cases care about more. So it might be that material equality isn't of any value at all. As I suggested earlier, there's a larger and larger number of people who think about this carefully that are arriving at that conclusion. Certainly it's not the only value, and it's not even the most important of social values. If we have to choose between equality and other values, forget about liberty for the time being. Think about other metrics for material well-being. Equality gives ground very, very quickly. It just doesn't have the authority that intuitively we might have begun thinking that it has. So what should we conclude? Well, the moral of the story, so far as I can see, is that we shouldn't think that material equality is a significant moral standard. It can't do that job that I was talking about earlier of providing us a normative criterion for assessing public policies or laws or institutions. Now, it's important to add that that doesn't mean that equality of every sort should be out of the picture, because material equality is not the only form of equality there is. There's also what we might call moral equality. And this is equality, some form of equality in our relations with each other. Sometime, and I'm sort of leaving open here what those might be because I think that's actually a complex enough subject to justify another lecture. But there are a variety of there are several varieties of moral equality that are completely immune from the problems that we've been raising for material equality. So it's important to understand the kind of attack that I've been giving here, because I think I have been giving an attack on equality, to understand that as an attack on material equality, not equality pure and simple. I said earlier on that we needed to be very clear about what form of equality we were interested in, and I think nothing I've said has suggested that we shouldn't be really interested in equality of our relations with one another of some form. So we've seen that there's problems with with thinking that what we should want from our government or political policies, laws, institutions is some form of material equality, whether that is equality of welfare or interests or resources or opportunity or luck. Left the door open to considering some form of moral equality. The line that I think is actually really attractive is in thinking that we can make sense of some sort of equality of rights that can fit that bill. I hesitate to use the term equal rights because that idea has been hijacked for a number of ideas that I think are actually tied back into various forms of material equality, and thus run into lots and lots of the problems that we've been talking about earlier. So it takes a lot of work to clarify what a plausible form of equality of rights is, a notion of equality of rights that can represent equality in our moral relations with each other, seeing each other as moral equals. But I think that's a worthwhile ideal, and one that if you love liberty, you should be quite interested in investigating. And that's where I'll stop. Thank you. Peter, back to you.
Yep, thanks a lot, Mark. Do we have any questions? Oh, okay, they're starting to pop up. Okay, we got a thank you for the great presentation. That's not really a question, but we got that.
Glad to hear it anyway.
If you have a question, just type it in the little question box. And I will read it. All right, we've got a couple of things, people pending as they're typing, so. Okay, this comes from John Zinsky. How do you feel about establishing equal opportunity to a minimum level of health care? I know you need to clarify the types of health care, but do you think such a system is open to discussion?
So the question is equal access to health care or something like that?
How do you feel about establishing equal opportunity to a minimum level of health care?
Well, I guess there'd be a couple of answers to that. As your question indicates, the devil's going to be in the details for any proposal like that. Maybe the most plausible and attractive way to do that is to think about that as one part of or one instance of the idea of some kind of a social minimum, to which we might think, yeah, it's government's task to make sure that nobody falls below that minimum. And as I said, there are some people with pretty good libertarian credentials. If you think Hayek has good libertarian credentials, which I'm certainly not going to dispute that, but think, yeah, there's a legitimate role for political institutions to do that. And you might say, you know, that plausibly includes not just food and housing, but some minimum standard of health care. But the problem with the issue of health care is that, I mean, what we care about actually isn't health care. What we care about is health. and healthcare has a funny relationship to health because some forms of health that we can get require no care at all, and some forms of bad health that we can get suck down care like there's no tomorrow. So we can actually recapitulate a lot of the problems that we were struggling to make sense of for material equality generally. We can recapitulate those if we start thinking about healthcare. So if we want to say, gosh, some kind of equality of access to healthcare really matters, does the idea of access mean something like a resources approach, where we say, I guess this was in the Ryan proposal for changing Medicare and Medicaid, that we basically provide a bundle of vouchers to folks, and they can spend the money as they wish? Is it more an outcomes sort of approach that no one should suffer disease that's curable or debilitating illness that there is a known cure for? So we can. The devil in the details about healthcare is going to be, okay, suppose we think there's an intuitive idea that we want to run with. What is that intuitive idea exactly? Do we have a resource story? Do we have an opportunity story? Do we have an outcome story? What story do we have? Having done that, we might say, especially if you like the social minimum idea, we might say, yeah, actually, that belongs in that bundle of a basic threshold that we can see that our political institutions and society ought to be sure that individuals don't fall below.
Great. On a similar note from Kyle Regan, how do you feel about the prospect of public education applying to the ideas of equality of opportunity?
Okay, that's a sore point. But I'll come clean here. I think it's horrible. So I think public education is a disaster at every level, in every way. One reason is that it politicizes the content of education, and another is that it removes people from the responsibility of education of their children and the children of others for whom they care. So education, I think, arguably is maybe the most important of the basic welfare goods. Now, it's tough to say that having enough food is not the most important. It's an extremely important welfare good. But it's different, I think, in fundamental ways because education is a good that's sort of socially directed, socially constructed maybe. What counts as a good education is something that we can have reasonable disagreement about. We can and do have reasonable disagreement about in a way that's not true of minimum caloric requirements or at least sort of large-scale basic health issues. John Stuart Mill, a century ago, mentioned the problems that he thought were necessarily attendant on government-provided education. He thought then, and a number of people still do think, that even if the wise thing is to not have government providing education, but to have it be in the business of being sure that everyone has something like an equal access to it. Politically now, that's proving to be an extraordinarily difficult ideal even to defend in the United States, let alone to try to bring about. The best we can do are voucher programs or that here or there. I think there's something fundamentally problematic about the idea of politicizing education as a welfare good and thinking that the burden for educating children really falls on society as a whole. As soon as you distribute the responsibility for educating other people's kids, as soon as you distribute that responsibility onto other people, reasonably you give them authority over what that education consists in. It's certainly unfair to burden people with the requirement that they provide something that they think is unjust or inappropriate or unwise. And once you give them authority over it, you've politicized both the supply and, both the resources and the content of education. And I think both of those are problematic. So precisely because I think that education is so important, I think there should be no public role for education whatsoever.
Great, thanks. This one I think has a little more, probably for people who know a little bit more about the philosophical details, but what do you make of Buchanan's political philosophy, specifically his use of the Rawlsian framework to arrive at a conclusion largely opposed to Rawls? Do you believe that the social contract is a legitimate method for discovering the role of equality in political philosophy?
So by this I assume you mean James Buchanan and not Alan Buchanan. The tradition that Buchanan works in is a well-known and well-respected one that I myself don't find very satisfying. I don't think it actually responds to some of the most significant moral requirements that our political institutions should be responding to. That said, I've only read some of Buchanan's stuff. I'm not familiar with it in depth. But broadly speaking, he comes out of the Hobbesian tradition. He's willing to accept a number of provisions about the Rawlsian framework that I think are problematic, and unwilling to challenge others. He's unwilling to challenge provisions that I find unacceptable, and he defends others that I think it doesn't make sense to take really seriously if you take liberty seriously. So although I have a lot of respect for Buchanan as a thinker, and obviously his contributions to economics are great, I don't find him a compelling political philosopher in that sense. That's just me, though.
The next one's from Aldrich Anderson. Oh, whoa, someone just popped up. Okay. As politics becomes more money-centric in both the electoral and legislative arenas, how do we maintain a reasonable degree of political equality in the face of rising economic inequality?
Right. So one of the big worries about material, that's a great question, because one of the real worries about material inequality is that somehow it carries over in ways that pollute or contaminate the political environment. And what we do think, so I mean, one story about what ways that we ought to be equal, if there's any form of equality, is in something like political or degree of political control, which is very often taken to mean, well, I don't know, control over our shared political lives, something like that. I myself am doubtful that you can ever distinguish the influence of economic control and political control. I think it's a farce to think that there is any significant degree, or ever has been any significant degree of political equality at any time. So one of the reasons I'm committed to more liberty and to diminished role for governmental institutions is precisely that reason. I think political equality is actually a poor proxy for the kind of moral equality that I was suggesting at the end of my presentation really matters. I think it does a very bad job, actually, of realizing moral equality, of a kind of equality of the authority that we have over one another, precisely because political authority is unequal moral authority. And if you compound that with the kinds of effects that people, I think rightly, worry about as to the effects of money on the political process, what you get are enormous distortions to what seems to me the right moral relationship that people ought to be standing in. But if you take that kind of moral standing seriously, it's precisely the wrong way to go to try to increase the scope and reach of political authority in order to counteract a very real problem of corruption from economic forces, whether they're forces of inequality or otherwise. All that's doing is throwing kerosene on the fire. So it's precisely because I think moral equality matters so much, and that political equality is only a very, very poor proxy for that kind of moral equality, that I think we would do better to take our eyes off the relationship between money and politics and focus on the relationship between money and between politics and basic moral relations between individuals. And if we do that, then we're going to think we actually want the scope of the political dimensions of our lives to be reduced as much as we possibly can. And to the extent that we reduce it, then the effects that we worry about from economic forces, those get diminished as well. I think we're going to get things the wrong way around if we're worried about politics and money instead of politics and moral equality. That's a great question, though.
Okay, the next question is from Matthew Dodson. One of the classical roles for government is providing protection/police. Given that there are many who attribute the relatively high amount of crime in the U.S. to the vast wealth disparity that exists in the United States, could wealth redistribution be justified as another way of protecting citizens from crime?
So one part of that question obviously is empirical. The question is, does wealth inequality translate to greater crime? I myself don't know of any evidence that that's the case. Arguably, the people that are most concerned about income inequality are saying that it's gotten worse over the last 20 or 30 years, say since the late 70s or early 80s. And the incidence of violent crime, I think by just about every indicator, has been going down over that period of time. So that would not be empirically, I think, a very good argument to make. And I guess, yeah, my overall reaction is to say, clearly we do care about physical security. We do care about the degree to which we're free from threats to our persons and property. That's seems like if there's any job that government ought to do, it's that. But it seems to me the connection between material inequality and a threat to physical safety is so tenuous. I myself wouldn't find that very convincing at all. There would have to be some stupendous argumentation for me to think that there was much of an argument there. I don't know of people that are making that case, even works like The Spirit Level that are arguing that inequality, material inequality, is a cause of various and sundry other nasty social developments. So far as I know, aren't claiming that. From what I know of The Spirit Level, again, a lot of these are empirical arguments that a social scientist is in much better position to assess than I am. But I just don't know of any evidence for any of those claims. So it would have to be really profound evidence, I think, to overcome burdens that we know there's cost to implementing policies to try to make people more equal as well. And the other thing that I think should make you pause is that there's a sense in which even if you think those arguments are so, that too is a change of subjects, because where we began, the sort of intuitive ideal that I meant to pick out with this slide, the photo was there, is that there's something that's good in itself about equality. It's desirable for its own sake, not just for its effects. So at the very least, one of the things that you'd want to recognize is, if you're attracted to that kind of argument, is saying, okay, I'm giving up on the idea that equality matters for its own sake, right? If you have the view that equality matters for its own sake, then you don't necessarily have to get involved in lots and lots of these empirical arguments and tenuous causal connections. Once you say, I don't care about it for its own sake, now I care about it because inequality causes problem X. That might benefit because problem X might get a lot of support as something that really is a serious problem we want to worry about, but now you've inherited a whole new set of problems in trying to establish a causal relationship that is going to be much more challenging, I think, than the initial intuition that people should be equal. That's something that I think has some legs in a way that's different from saying, okay, now let me start running regressions to show you that there's a causal relationship between material inequality and some other social problem. So, yeah, that's probably not a tidy answer. I do think it introduces questions that I'm probably less qualified to speak to as a philosopher, precisely because they involve causal connections in the social world that other specialists know much more about than I do.
Awesome. This next one is from John Pascarella. It's kind of a lengthy one. With public discourse on questions of the good life being relatively weak, since classical liberalism encourages a tolerant, morally neutral position, how good of a chance does the United States have of carrying out a serious discussion on moral equality? Also, isn't the matter further complicated by the U.S. exhibiting characteristics of Tocqueville's mild despotism, which has in some respects taken away from us the trouble of thinking and the pain of living, since people are so wrapped up in satisfying their desires?
Right. I'm a little bit wary of big generalizations because it seems to me, for example, that there's a lot of discourse about what counts as the good life or what counts as welfare. It may not be showing up on the op-ed page in the New York Times, but if you think about the proliferation of forums in which people think and explore those questions, they're everywhere, right? You think about churches, think about book reading groups, think about blogs and exchanges on websites over features of what counts as a good life. Think about various forms of art, television and theater and drama and movies and so forth, where in various different ways what people, and certainly in philosophy, people propose explicitly or implicitly ideals of what constitutes a good life, and they get hashed out. Now, it does not necessarily take the form of a he said, she said formal debate, but I guess I'm very wary to jump into to accept the idea that sort of vigorous debate about that doesn't go on. I think it may not be going on the pages of the New York Times. It may not be going on in Congress, which for my money is just as well, because I doubt there's going to be very much useful in conversation coming out of Congress. But I think it does go on. Now, that said, I think you're probably right to look at various social trends and think, these are really not contributing to constructive debate or productive debate. And you might well get me to agree that that's the case. But I don't think I have much distinctive competence either to judge how likely those trends are to continue, or and I'm certainly not good as an activist, as someone who could think, what kinds of strategies could we have for reversing those? I think the contribution that I have to make, if I have to make one, is in trying to think clearly about the ideals themselves. And so I think what philosophers have to contribute here maybe is not a lot about either assessing the nature of the body public or ways of changing it, but what we can contribute is trying to think more clearly about the ideals that we care about, both as individual people, as individuals that have social relationships of all kinds, including political relationships with others as citizens. These are the ideals that matter to us, and there's a lot to be gained and a lot lost there's a lot to be lost if we don't have clear conceptions of those values. My own view is that much of the intuitive sort of political appeal of equality is simply mistaken. And in being simply mistaken, that's not just sort of not good. It's a positive evil because it obstructs the possibility of more clear-minded political dialogue. So the point that I was making earlier about the starving kids is one. Talking about inequality is taking up time that we could really be thinking about what kinds of institutions and arrangements can we make so that those who are most needy get their needs met. And every minute that we're spending yammering on about equality is a minute that's lost to thinking or developing proposals or acting on ways of making the needy better off. And to me, that's just tragic because there's no there for the ideal of equality that we're engaged in arguing about. I don't know if that answers your question, but I guess I have mixed reactions.
Awesome. Well, we're about out of time, so we're going to close it up right now. Thanks a lot, Mark, for the great presentation. Thank you to all of our participants for all the questions. I hope you can all continue coming back to our webinars to learn more throughout the year. Our next one is next Wednesday, April 27th, where Dan D'Amico and Walter Block will be delivering a talk on privatizing the roads. To register, visit the website at studentsforliberty.org. You'll also be sent a link to register and a follow-up email. In the email, you'll also receive a survey to evaluate the webinar. Please take a couple of minutes to fill it out. It helps us know how to improve the programs and make these webinars more interesting for you. With that, we are officially wrapped up. Thanks again, Mark.
My pleasure, Peter.
All right. Have a good day, everybody.